You're not getting the house. I'm taking it back." These were the exact words my husband's mother shouted across the living room at 7:43 p.m. on Tuesday, June 14th. 2022, I had spent 3 years saving every single penny from my $38,472.89 salary at the boutique in downtown Tampa to renovate her old Victorian house on Maplewood Drive, a house she promised she'd leave to us, and in 15 minutes, everything I had believed in crumbled like the plaster from her ceiling that I had fixed with my own hands, a smell of fresh paint still. Lingering in the hallway, the scent of cedar from the new shelves I had built with my own 2 hands mixed with the faint aroma of her old perfume that always reminded me of my grandmother, and yet here I was stunned, frozen in disbelief. And my husband just stood there in the middle of the room, looking like a deer caught in headlights, while his mother waved her hand dismissively, like I was some child throwing a tantrum. It was surreal, absolutely surreal. The wallpaper I had chosen in soft lavender lined with cream trim suddenly felt like a mocking laugh echoing in my ears, and the sunlight through the bay window reflected off the polished oak floors and made everything feel painfully real. I remember the exact sound of my heart pounding against my rib cage, and the faint creak of the stairs in the hallway, as if the house itself was groaning under the weight of betrayal. And I froze for a second, just trying to breathe and make sense of it all. I thought back to the morning when my husband had promised me over coffee in our tiny kitchen on 22nd Avenue in St. Petersburg, that everything was settled, that we had his mother's blessing. She said the house would be mine for the first time in my life. I felt seen, valued, like all the sacrifices mattered. I had spent the last 3 summers painting the fence, sanding the windows, planting roses and jasmine around the garden that was her mother's pride and joy, and I had done it because I believed in family and love and commitment. And yet now all of that was suddenly meaningless. You ever feel like your whole world just collapses in seconds, that your efforts, your love, your sweat, your late nights spent measuring and hammering and repainting are suddenly invisible? Well, that's exactly how I felt that day. The hallway smelled of fresh varnish and betrayal at the same time, and the soft humming of the old fridge in the kitchen sounded like a cruel metronome counting down the last seconds of my dreams. And I turned to my husband and whispered, "We can't just let this happen, right?" And he mumbled, I don't know. And my mind raced back to the first time I had met her mother in 2019 in that tiny cafe on Jefferson Street in Sarasota. She had smiled and said, "Oh, you're the one who wants the house." And I had nodded so eagerly, thinking it was a promise, a gentle, yes, a soft whisper of future security. And now it was all twisted into a declaration, a loss, a statement of power. I had never felt so small and humiliated, and yet so alive, like I could almost taste the injustice in the air, thick and sweet, like molasses in July. And I remember thinking right then and there, no one is going to watch this and do nothing. And that thought sparked a fire in me that I didn't know was there. My hands were trembling, but I felt a pulsive rhythm of determination beating inside, like the sound of a clock ticking to midnight. When everything changes, I looked around and saw my neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, across the street, peeking from behind her lace curtains. She had seen the confrontation. She would later tell me she thought my husband's mother had lost her mind, and that she had never seen me look so furious and resolute at the same time. And in that exact moment, I knew something had shifted, something had broken, and something was about to rise. I didn't know how or when, but I promised myself that by nightfall my life would look completely different, and I would reclaim what was mine, and not just mine, but the dignity and respect I had earned. The smell of the roses I had planted, and the echo of laughter from the porch I had painted with my own hands would witness my victory. And you know what I can't stop thinking about? I can't stop thinking about how many of us have worked our whole lives to be promised security only to have it ripped away in 15 minutes. And if you've ever felt that, if you've ever put your heart and soul into something and been betrayed, I want you to comment below. Tell me your story, because you're not alone. And trust me, what happened next would change everything forever in ways I could never have imagined. And this is just a beginning. Wait until you see how it unfolded step by step, minute by minute, the humiliation, the shock, the twisted words, the gasp of onlookers, every little detail. Because in exactly 15 minutes, my whole world would turn upside down. But I would rise, and you'll want to see exactly how it happened. I still remember the first time I set foot in that old house on Maplewood Drive. It was the summer of 2019, and I was 52 years old. I had just finished a long shift at the boutique downtown in Tampa, and my husband had surprised me with a visit to see his mother's place, a small Victorian with green shutters, peeling paint on the corners, and a creaky wooden porch that smelled faintly of cedar and old varnish I remember, stepping on the warped floorboards and hearing them groan like they were. Whispering secrets, I had never known the garden was wild and overgrown with roses that had bloomed untamed for years and jasmine that climbed recklessly over fences, and in that moment, I felt something stir inside me, a sense of home that I hadn't felt since I was a little girl. Growing up in Clearwater, my mother used to hum in the kitchen, and my father would polish the old wooden floors on Sundays, and somehow I saw echoes of that life. In the chaos of this house, my husband squeezed my hand and said, "You'll love it here someday, it'll be yours," and I believed him completely. I had always been the type to put my heart into everything, and I started immediately dreaming about the life I could build there, painting the walls pastel colors, choosing curtains that let sunlight filter softly into the living room, and imagining quiet mornings, sipping coffee on the porch with the roses in full bloom and the faint hum of bees buzzing around. I spent the next 3 years investing everything I could into that house. I remember saving exactly $12,743.67 from my boutique salary just to fix the fence and buy new soil for the garden. My husband covered the cost of the paint, which was $3,512.50. And together we spent every weekend sanding and polishing and planting every flower I could get my hands on, every brick and board I touched. Felt like I was carving my own future into reality. I didn't mind the sweat or the blisters, because I could see what was becoming, and I could see myself. There it was, tangible. My husband's mother seemed pleased at first. She would sit on the porch in her rocking chair with her knitting and watch me work, and sometimes she would call out, "Careful with that board," or "Don't forget the shutters," and I would nod and smile, pretending I hadn't noticed a little smirk when I mentioned repainting the hallway in soft lavender. But I justified it, thinking she was just playful. It never occurred to me that she would ever turn against us. I bought the old Tiffany lamp for exactly $276.34 at a small antique shop on Main Street in Sarasota, because I wanted to add a touch of warmth and history. And every time I dusted it, I felt connected to both the past and the future. The neighbors were kind at first. Mrs. Henderson from across the street brought me homemade cookies when she saw me planting the jasmine, and Mr. Carlson waved from his porch. Every morning I felt like I was becoming part of a living story, a story that was meant to last forever, and it gave me hope. Because at 52, you think you've learned the value of home, you think you've learned the meaning of loyalty and family, and I had never imagined that all that effort would become invisible in the blink of an eye. I remember the nights I stayed late sanding the railings, my hands raw and aching, and the smell of sawdust mixed with my coffee kept me awake in anticipation of what the house would become. I kept imagining hosting my husband's mother for tea in the freshly painted kitchen, showing her the roses I planted and hearing her laugh and say, "It looks beautiful. You've done a wonderful job." And for a while, that image was real, and I felt a warmth in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. I made sacrifices. I stopped going to my sister's in Orlando for weekends because I needed to focus on the garden and the repairs. I cut back on my favorite jazz nights at the Tampa Bay Club to save money for new curtains and rugs. I even skipped my annual vacation in Key West because I wanted to make sure the porch was perfect, every plank polished, every flower planted just right. I did it all not because I had, but because I wanted to honor the promise that had been made, and because I believe in the family we were building together. And now, looking back, I can see how blind I was, how I put my trust and love into someone else's hands. And that trust was about to be tested in ways I had never imagined. And if you've ever devoted years of your life to something only to feel the weight of betrayal, you'll understand the way my chest tightened every time I thought of the house, the way my hands trembled when I recalled her words at night. "You're not getting the house." And I want you to remember that these early days of planning, the painting, the dreaming are what made the eventual betrayal so unbearable, because the more love and sweat you put in, the harder it hits when it's taken away. And just wait until you see what comes next, the first signs of disrespect, the little cracks that appeared. Slowly at first, and then widen day by day. It's coming in the next chapter, and I promise you it will make your blood boil, because this was only the beginning, and the heartbreak was already starting to take shape. The summer of 2020 was brutal in Tampa, the humidity thick and sticky, but I didn't care. I spent every single weekend at the Maplewood house painting, sanding, repairing, fixing things that no one else wanted to touch. I remember exactly how much I spent: $137.89 on new windows and $1,254.12 on weatherproofing the old roof. I had my hands raw from sanding the porch railings for hours, And yet I felt a quiet pride. Every scrape and brushstroke was a promise to myself, a promise that I was building a future not just for me, but for our family. And my husband always reminded me, this is your dream too. And I believe him every word. I planted 47 rose bushes along the front garden, meticulously measuring spacing and sun exposure, as if I was tending to tiny pieces of hope, every bloom a symbol of my devotion to this life I was building. And at first his mother seemed approving. She would call out from her chair, "Don't forget the shutters on the north side," or "Watch out for the paint on the floorboards," and I would nod smiling while secretly thinking how sweet it was that she noticed the little things. And yet slowly the tone began to change. It started with small comments like, "Why did you spend so much on that rug? $412.75. Was it really necessary?" Or, "The lavender paint is too girly, don't you think?" And I brushed it off thinking she was joking or being particular. But deep down I felt a flicker of unease, like the first crack in a porcelain vase I had been so careful, so attentive for. Years, and now little criticism started to pierce me. I remember one Saturday in August, I spent 6 hours repainting the hallway, just to find her standing there. When I arrived, she looked at me with a faint smirk and said, "I suppose you like this color more than I do." And I said politely, I thought it would brighten the space and make it feel welcoming. And she rolled her eyes and walked away. I remember the exact creak of the floorboards under her heels and the faint scent of her Chanel No. 5, mixing with the paint and varnish. And in that moment, I felt a strange mix of humiliation and disbelief. The subtle undermining that I had ignored for so long was becoming more frequent and sharper, and I started noticing it everywhere, in the way she would casually rearrange my carefully placed flowers, or the way she would comment on the furniture I had chosen with such condescension. One day, I overheard her on the phone with a friend saying, "I don't know why she's acting like she owns the place." And I froze in the kitchen. The smell of jasmine outside, mixing with the coffee I had just brewed, made my stomach twist. The betrayal was tangible. It had a flavor, bitter and metallic. And I realized I had been blindsided by my own hope and trust. And yet I tried to justify it, thinking perhaps she was just having a bad day. Maybe she was tired. Maybe she didn't mean it. But the frequency increased. I started noticing my husband's slight hesitation when he spoke to her. He would say, "Don't take it personally, she's just," and trail off as if he didn't know how to finish the sentence. And that silence screamed louder than words. I remember counting the money I had spent on a house, exactly $18,927.42 in total renovations and garden improvements over 3 years. And the thought that all of that could be dismissed with a flick of her hand made my hand shake. I began to feel a knot of anger and helplessness tighten in my chest, but I kept going because I believed in what we were creating. I kept painting the windows dollar. $357.29 for new hinges and fixing the porch rails and planting the 12 jasmine bushes along the east side, because I wanted the house to be perfect. And every time I imagined her turning away or sneering, I felt a mix of sorrow and determination. I remembered my childhood summers in Clearwater when my parents worked tirelessly in our own garden, my mother humming and my father polishing floors. I thought of those lessons of patience and diligence, and I tried to channel that energy into this house, but the tension was rising, and the subtle undermining now felt like a storm cloud hanging over every decision I made. And still I tried to focus on love I put into the space, because in the back of my mind, I thought if I just kept being patient, if I just kept working, she would come around, she would see my effort, she would acknowledge my sacrifices. And I kept hoping, even as the little cracks widened into gaping holes. I kept believing in the promise he had made to me, and that belief became a silent fire that I carried with me every time I walked through a creaking front door, every time I wiped the sweat from my brow and smelled the roses I had planted and the jasmine that clung to the fence. And I knew that what had begun as small gestures of care had turned into something much larger. It had turned into a claim not just to a house, but to the dignity of years of work and love. And in my mind, I could feel the storm approaching. The first real confrontation was coming, and I promise you, when it happened, it would shock everyone who had been watching and leave no doubt about what was at stake. It started on a Monday morning, August 23rd, 2021, at precisely 8:17 a.m. I had just finished watering the jasmine and trimming the roses when I heard her voice echoing through the house. "Why do you always have to do everything wrong?" she said with a sharp edge while standing at the top of the stairs, her arms crossed and her heels clicking against the polished oak. I froze in the living room, holding a watering can, the scent of jasmine and fresh soil mixing with the faint aroma of her Chanel No. 5. It was as if the air itself was judging me. I tried to reply calmly, "I'm just trying to help." And she sneered, "Help you say? You're ruining the place." And in that moment, I felt a hot flush of humiliation creep up my neck. The neighbors would later tell me. They heard her shouting from across the street, and Mrs. Henderson peeked through her lace curtains, shaking her head disapproval at my supposed incompetence. My husband was in the kitchen, trying to intervene. "Mom, please don't speak like that," he said in a low tone, but she ignored him and continued. "I've seen better paying jobs from a kindergartner, and I felt the sting of every ounce of effort I had poured into this house reduced to ridicule in a single sentence. I remember gripping the railing of the porch behind me, the rough wood biting into my palms as I tried to steady my shaking body. I had spent exactly $1,872.50 on new brushes and rollers, and every stroke of the walls had been meant to honor her, and now it was all a weapon against me. And she didn't stop there. She went into the kitchen, opening the drawers and moving the silverware around, commenting, "Who taught you to organize these? You call this neat?" And I felt my cheeks burn with embarrassment and frustration. Sound the drawers slamming echoed like a gavel passing judgment on my life. She started inviting friends over unexpectedly, and they would watch me work and make comments like, "Oh, honey, maybe that lamp is too fancy for this old place." And I could hear their laughter as if it were directed right at me. I tried to maintain dignity. I tried to smile and nod while inside I was simmering in the first whisper of anger began to grow. I remember my mornings waking up at 6:12 a.m. every Saturday, sanding the porch rails before the sun got too hot, the sweat dripping down my back, the smell of sawdust and coffee filling my senses. And now all that seemed meaningless. The first real humiliation that day was when she took out her phone and filmed me arranging the flowers. She called it "How Not to Garden" and posted it on the neighborhood social media group with dozens of neighbors commenting and laughing. I felt every eye upon me. I felt the weight of their judgment and the sting of public embarrassment. I tried to speak to her calmly. "Please stop. This is private." And she waved me off, saying, "Oh, don't be so sensitive." As if my dignity were nothing to her. I tried to find solace in my husband's support, but he seemed paralyzed, uncertain, and I realized for the first time that I might have to stand alone. I remember hearing the exact tone of her voice cutting through the morning air. "You think this house is yours? You've done nothing to earn it." And I felt my heart drop and the world tilt around me. But in that moment, something shifted. I noticed Mrs. Henderson across the street, her mouth open in shock at the audacity of her words, and even Mr. Carlson shaking his head disapprovingly from his porch. And I realized that I wasn't invisible. Someone was witnessing this injustice. And that thought gave me a strange sort of power and courage. I began to notice the little ways she tried to assert dominance, moving objects I had carefully arranged, changing the curtains I had sewn myself, and making comments in front of other people, each act a calculated humiliation designed to make me feel small and insignificant. But each act also sparked a quiet fire inside me, a fire I wasn't ready to extinguish yet. I tried to remind myself of all the weekends I had sacrificed the exact $3,512.50. Spent on paint and repairs, the 47 rose bushes planted with meticulous care, the countless hours sanding the porch and polishing the floors, and I realized that none of that could be taken from me because it was mine in spirit, even if not in law. Yet the escalation was just beginning. I could feel it in the air. Each step of hers a deliberate move to provoke me, each glance a test of patience, and I knew that I had to be careful, but also that I couldn't continue to be passive. The humiliation was rising, but so was my resolve. And I want you to imagine standing in that exact place, watching someone dismantle your efforts piece by piece, publicly ridiculing you and knowing that the world is watching, because that's exactly what I experienced, and it was unbearable. And at the same time, the first spark of awakening began to form. And just wait until the next chapter, because the apex of this humiliation is about to hit, and it will make every injustice I've described until now look small by comparison. And you'll see exactly how it escalated and how even the neighbors could no longer remain silent, because the stage was set for confrontation, and the storm was coming. It was Wednesday, September 15th, 2021 at exactly 3:42 p.m. when everything crossed a line. The sky was a harsh gray over Tampa, and the humidity made the air feel like a thick, wet blanket. I had spent the morning sanding the porch railings, one more time checking the windows for leaks, and planting the last of the 12 jasmine bushes on the east side, when she stormed into the backyard, her heels slapping against the wooden steps and her voice carrying like a whip. "What are you doing now?" she demanded, her eyes scanning every flower, every railing, every brushstroke. I tried to answer calmly. "Just finishing up the bushes I planted last week." And she scoffed, "Finishing up? You call that finishing?" It's a mess, and in that moment, I felt the first real sting of public humiliation because my husband had invited his cousin Diane over for tea, and Diane had been watching from the porch, and now she was witnessing the entire debacle, her mouth slightly open in shock and disbelief, and I felt every second stretch into eternity, the sun glinting off the wet leaves of the jasmine, making them look almost mocking. I remember the exact sensation of the sun on my neck mixed with the heavy smell of freshly dug soil and sweat. As I tried to hold my composure, she grabbed the watering can from my hands and flung it onto the ground, spilling $34.76 worth of water over the new soil I had carefully measured and planted. And then she picked up the small Tiffany lamp I had bought for $276.34 and waved it in the air. "Do you think you're in charge of decorating now?" She sneered as Diane's eyes widened in astonishment. I felt the ground tilt beneath me, the sound of broken glass shattering like the echo of years of effort and care being reduced to ridicule in an instant. And then she went further. She invited two of her friends who lived in Clearwater over. "Come see how ridiculous this is," she called out. And within 5 minutes, 3 more people were standing in my backyard, cameras out, phones, recording every little movement, every blush, every tremor. I tried to speak, but my voice caught, "Please stop. This is humiliating." And she laughed, a cruel, high-pitched laugh that cut through the thick Florida air. "Humiliating? Oh, honey, you think this is humiliation? This is just reality." And in that moment, the neighbors started gathering across the street, Mrs. Henderson shaking her head and murmuring to Mr. Carlson, "I can't believe she's doing this," the sound of whispered judgment mixing with her laughter. I remembered all the nights I had stayed up sanding the porch, the exact $3,512.50 in paint spent to $2,137.89 on windows, and the $1,254.12 on the roof, repair every dollar, every drop of sweat, every early morning at 6:12 a.m. spent polishing floor seemed meaningless. She was systematically dismantling everything I had worked for in front of an audience. And then she took it one step further. She went through the drawers. I had organized the silverware I had lined up exactly as my grandmother had taught me in Clearwater and dumped them on the kitchen table, commenting, "Look at this chaos. Do you really think anyone respects your taste?" And I felt my chest tighten like it was being squeezed by invisible hands, the smell of fresh paint, the earthy scent of soil, and the sharp tang of metal from the silverware all merging into a nauseating cocktail of embarrassment and rage. I could feel my hands trembling and my heart race, and my husband looked like he wanted to intervene, but stayed frozen, as if paralyzed by indecision. And then she whispered loudly enough for Diane and the other 3 guests to hear, "This house will never be hers as long as I'm alive." And every word was like a knife twisting in my gut. I felt tears prick the corner of my eyes, but I didn't allow them to fall. I clenched my fists and focused on the sun-dappled leaves, the smell of jasmine and roses reminding me that even as she tried to crush me in that moment, I still had my integrity, my effort, my patience, and the first seeds of determination began to sprout, a quiet fire inside me, a fire that would not be extinguished. She underestimated me. She thought humiliation was enough to bend me. She didn't know that. Every insult, every sneer, every shove to my dignity was planting the roots of what was about to become a reckoning. And as I stood there surrounded by a small crowd, cameras capturing every second, I felt a strange mix of anger and clarity, like the storm had revealed my own strength in the face of injustice. And I want you to picture this exact scene, every neighbor whispering, every phone camera pointed, every friend gasping, and me standing in the middle of it all trembling. But unbrokenness was the apex, the crescendo of humiliation, and yet within it the first sparks of the coming reversal were forming. And just wait until the next chapter, because the moment of awakening is near, and you'll see exactly how I found the strength to no longer be a passive victim, and how the first decisive moves of my journey toward reclaiming what was mine began. It happened late that Thursday evening, October 7th, 2021, at exactly 9:18 p.m. I was sitting on the porch of the Maplewood house, the air thick with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the faint smell of cedar from the old railing. I had polished myself. I could still hear the echo of her words from the previous day. "This house will never be yours as long as I'm alive." And normally I would have felt a heavy weight of humiliation pressing down on me. But this time something inside shifted. I remember looking at the exact crack in the oak floor where I had spilled paint last. Some were $21.87 worth of a mishap I had laughed about back then, And I suddenly realized that all those small efforts, all of that sweat and time and money had not been for her. They had been for me, for my dignity, for the proof that I could create and build and nurture something beautiful even under pressure. I felt my shoulders straighten and my breathing slow as the house itself was exhaling with me. I realized in that moment that I had underestimated myself. For years, I had believed that her power over me was absolute, that her words could define my worth. But sitting there on the porch, the cicadas buzzing and the distant sound of traffic on 22nd Avenue in St. Petersburg, I felt the first flicker of clarity, that I was not powerless, that I had resources that had been hidden even from myself. All those years of savings and investments in antiques, like the Tiffany lamp, $276.34, and the meticulous records I kept of every repair, every purchase, every hour spent on the house, suddenly became tools in my hands. I remember my grandmother teaching me how to manage money and negotiate deals, and suddenly it clicked. I had skills, I had knowledge, I had financial leverage, I had witnesses, Mrs. Henderson across the street, Mr. Carlson shaking his head in disapproval at her behavior, and the neighbors who had started to film the humiliations. The power of observation and documentation was on my side. I felt a subtle but unmistakable thrill running through me like electricity from my fingertips to my toes, and I realized that I had been preparing for this confrontation. Without even knowing it, I could see it now. Every comment, every sneer, every phone recording was not a weapon against me, but evidence of what was wrong, what was unjust, what had to change. I stood up and felt the porch boards creak under my weight, and for the first time in months, the act of standing felt like reclaiming territory. I remember my husband's hesitant voice earlier, "Don't take it personally," and I realized that I didn't need to be controlled by his hesitation anymore. I could choose my response. I could set the terms for what came next, and I felt the first real pulse of determination that no longer relied on hope, but on strategy, a plan of quiet, but firm resolve to not let her continue to dismantle my life, to assert what was mine legally and morally. I closed my eyes and let the night wind brush against my face, the smell of roses mixing with jasmine and dirt grounding me. I whispered to myself, I will not be small anymore. And in that moment, the fear and shame melted into a focused awareness. I could almost hear the echo of my own voice from childhood telling me to stand up to injustice, to protect what was mine. And suddenly I knew that the time for passive endurance was over. I began reviewing in my mind the exact savings. I had $38,472.89 from boutique earnings plus $12,743.67 from side projects, meticulously accounted for every expense and every effort I had put into this house, and the realization hit me that I had a form of power she never imagined. I had financial, legal, and moral leverage, all quietly accumulating. While she assumed I was weak, I also noticed a subtle shift in the neighbor's perception of surprise on Mrs. Henderson's face, the whispered conversations on 22nd Avenue. And suddenly, I felt not alone. I felt the beginning of an army of witnesses and allies forming around me in the quiet night, and I knew the next steps had to be calculated, deliberate, and unstoppable. The awakening was complete. I felt the first taste of empowerment coursing through me, a spark ready to ignite a fire that would reclaim what had been denied. And I want you to imagine that feeling, the clarity, the sudden knowledge that you are stronger than they think, that you are smarter than they assume, that you have hidden reserves of power waiting to be unleashed. And just wait until the next chapter, because the calm before the storm is ending and the strategic decision is about to be made, and you'll see exactly how I turned from victim to a force she could not control, and how the first moves of reclaiming my life began. It was Monday, October 11th, 2021 at exactly 6:07 p.m. I was in the Maplewood House office sitting at the old oak desk. I had refurbished myself. A scent of polish would mix with a faint aroma of jasmine creeping in from the open window. I had measured exactly 23 inches for the new curtain rod and installed it with my own hands. Just that morning, I felt a calm clarity, unlike anything I had ever experienced before. The storm of humiliation behind me had transformed into a focused purpose. I had spent countless nights adding every receipt, every repair, every paintbrush purchase to my ledger. Every dollar accounted for $38,472.89 from boutique work, plus side income meticulously tracked $12,743.67 for garden and repairs. And suddenly, all those numbers were no longer just evidence of effort. They were leverage, legal leverage, moral leverage, and proof of my commitment. I picked up my phone and called the attorney I had briefly consulted years ago about estate matters. His voice surprised me on the line as, "Anderson, it's been a while," and I said calmly, "Yes, It's time we move forward. And suddenly every moment of doubt melted away. I felt the first real power surge through me like electricity coursing from my fingertips to my toes. I could almost hear the echo of my grandmother in clear water reminding me to stand firm, to never let injustice go unchallenged. I stood up and walked through the house, checking the exact spacing of the rose bushes. I had planted 47 in total. On the front lawn, the petals glowing in the sunset, I ran my fingers along the railing I had sanded and polished, and realized that everything I had built was a testament to my strength and patience, and now it was a tool for reclaiming what was mine. I remember the neighbors watching the humiliations, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Carlson, and even Diane from that terrible September day. The cameras, the whispers, the judgments had all been recorded, and now those witnesses became allies in my silent campaign. I drafted a list in my head of exactly what needed to be done: contracts, correspondence, photographic evidence, and timing for confronting the issue legally and publicly. I began mentally rehearsing each conversation, each statement I would make, every word, carefully measure. My husband looked at me that evening with a hint of awe and asked quietly, "Are you ready?" And I smiled with quiet determination. I've never been more ready. I reviewed every single purchase again: $1,872.50 on brushes, $2,137.89 on windows, $3,512.50 on paint, $276.34 on the Tiffany lamp. Every investment a reminder how much I had endured and how much I had grown. I knew now that patience and endurance were my allies, but strategy and action were my weapons of calm before the storm had ended, and the next step required deliberate planning. I could feel the shift in the atmosphere of the house. Every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo my newfound strength. Every fragrance from the garden seemed to cheer me on, as if the roses and jasmine themselves were witnesses to my resolve. I took a deep breath, inhaling the jasmine and the cedar, and felt the tension leave my shoulders, replaced with the cool focus of someone who had a plan and the courage to execute it. I started noting down key witnesses, exact dates, hours, and details of every insult, every humiliation, every act of interference she had committed, and I realized that this catalog of evidence was a powerful shield and a sword at the same time. I could see in my mind a confrontation that would come, the precise words I would use, the calm, measured voice, the exact steps to assert my rights and my dignity, and I knew that the neighbors would see it all. The friends would gasp, everyone would bear witness, and that realization made my spine straighten and my voice grow firmer in my mind. I whispered softly to myself, I will not let this continue. Not today. Not ever. And I felt a strange sense of calm exhilaration building inside me like the first surge of power after a long drought. I realized that the decision was not just emotional. It was strategic and unstoppable. And every calculation in my mind formed a blueprint for reclaiming what was mine, and beyond the financial investments, beyond the physical labor. It was about reclaiming respect, dignity, and asserting the truth of my life. Experience and just wait until the next chapter, because the first signs of my true power will begin to manifest, and you'll see how she starts to realize that I am no longer the person to be underestimated, and how the tides of control begin to shift ever so subtly but irreversibly. It was Friday, October 22nd, 2021 at precisely 10:05 a.m. when the first ripple of surprise hit the Maplewood house. The morning sun poured through the green shutters, highlighting the pastel lavender walls I had painted with such care 3 years ago, and the scent of freshly cut roses and jasmine mingled with the faint aroma of cedar from the porch railings I had polished myself. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, 3 firm raps that seemed to echo like a herald of change. I opened it to see Mr. Thompson from Clearwater Law Office, standing there holding a thick manila envelope. He looked at me with a mixture of awe and curiosity. "Ed Anderson, I believe you've been waiting for this," he said calmly, and handed me the envelope. I felt my pulse spike, my hand slightly trembling, as I took it inside the kitchen, the very same kitchen where a few weeks ago she had thrown my silverware and disdained the weight of the envelope was reassuring and substantial. I opened it carefully, and inside were copies of legal documents proving that the house had been earmarked for me in the event of my mother-in-law's incapacity, and included detailed records of renovations and expenditures, exactly $38,472.89 meticulously documented, and $12,743.67 from side projects accounted for. Every receipt, every paint job, every window replaced, and every rose bush planted. The evidence was undeniable. I could almost hear the whisper of the night wind outside, as if the universe itself was acknowledging my patience and precision. At that moment, Diane, the cousin who had witnessed the backyard humiliations, arrived unexpectedly. "I thought I'd check on you," she said nervously, and I smiled subtly. "You're just in time to see what she didn't expect." The first flicker of realization crossed her face. I could feel the air shift as the first subtle signs of my power began to manifest. Mrs. Henderson across the street waved subtly, and I knew she had heard the commotion earlier, and Mr. Carlson's nod of approval carried. Wait, it was as if the neighborhood itself had become an audience for the impending reversal. I carefully laid out the documents on the polished oak table and recounted every expense, every investment, every moment of dedication. $1,872.50 for brushes, $2,137.89 on windows, $3,512.50 on paint, $276.34 Tiffany lamp, every penny a testament to my commitment, and every note meticulously annotated with the dates and times. I had performed the work, and then I heard the first sound that truly confirmed the shift, of faint gas from the hallway. As my mother-in-law appeared unannounced, she paused mid-step, and her expression shifted from smug arrogance to cautious curiosity. Her eyes darted to the envelope, and then to the neatly laid-out receipts and documents. She had never seen me like this, so composed, so prepared. I watched her take a step back, as if realizing that the ground beneath her control had started to crack. And then I spoke. "Clearly, Mom, I believe you'll want to look at these documents carefully." She nodded slowly. No words yet, just a flicker of doubt in her eyes, and I could feel the tension in the room like static electricity building. The first witness's surprise was palpable. Diane's eyes widened. Mrs. Henderson's hand froze mid-wave, and Mr. Carlson adjusted his hat, as if sensing the power dynamic shifting. I remembered the countless nights I had spent sanding the porch at 6:12 a.m., the exact spacing of the 47 rose bushes, and the hours spent polishing floors and cleaning windows, and I realized that all that diligence was finally paying off, not as revenge, but as validation. My posture was firm, my gaze steady, and every word I spoke carried a quiet authority that had never been noticed before. I began calmly explaining the legal precedents, the documented expenses, and the testimony of witnesses. Everything here is accounted for, and it proves that my dedication to this house is recognized by law and community. And she stumbled slightly, a subtle shake in her hand. Realizing perhaps for the first time that her control was not absolute, the first cracks appeared not with anger, but with subtle, almost imperceptible fear, and I felt a thrill knowing that this was only the beginning. The documents, the numbers, the witnesses all worked together, forming a web of undeniable authority around me, and I could see in her eyes the dawning realization that the tables were turning. And just wait until the next chapter, because this is when the full magnitude of my power becomes undeniable, and you'll see how every act of humiliation she committed becomes evidence of her own miscalculation and the beginning of her unraveling. It was Monday, October 25th, 2021, at exactly 2:33 p.m. I was in the Maplewood house living room, the sunlight streaming through the green shutters, illuminating every corner of the freshly painted walls, the scent of jasmine and roses stronger than ever, as if the garden itself was celebrating the turning tide. The Tiffany lamp, $276.34. I had carefully placed on a side table, cast a soft glow over the documents neatly arranged on the polished oak table. Every receipt, every note, every photo, $38,472.89 in renovations, and $12,743.67 from side projects now, forming a mountain of undeniable proof that my dedication had been meticulous and unwavering. I had called in the witnesses, Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Carlson, Diane, and even the neighbors from 22nd Avenue, and I could feel their eyes on the scene like a silent jury. The doorbell rang, and she arrived exactly as usual, her heels clicking against the porch steps, the smell of Chanel No. 5 strong in the warm Florida air. But this time I was ready. She stopped mid-step the moment she saw the arrangement and the witnesses. Her confident smirk faltered, and I could see the first real signs of panic in her eyes. I greeted her calmly. "Mom, please have a seat." She hesitated, then slowly lowered herself onto the sofa across from me, and I began laying out the evidence calmly and systematically. Every expenditure, every investment, Every meticulous effort explained clearly and without emotion the $1,872.50 on brushes, $2,137.89 on windows, $3,512.50 on paint. The exact number of 47 rows bushes planted and precise. Locations, all carefully documented. I could see her swallowing hard, her fingers clutching her handbag, eyes flicking nervously to the witnesses, watching her every reaction. I didn't realize. She began, her voice faltering. I held her gaze evenly. It's not about what you realize. It's about what is documented and what has been witnessed. This house, the efforts, the investments, they are recognized by law and community, and I have every right to assert what has been promised to me. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustle of leaves outside the window. The witnesses leaned in slightly, Mrs. Henderson shaking her head, Diane's eyes wide, Mr. Carlson muttering softly, "Finally, justice." And the power in the room shifted completely. I could feel in the air as if every molecule had realigned. The small smirk she had worn for years melted into a tremor of disbelief. She glanced at the documents, then at the witnesses and back. At me, and for the first time, she seemed small. Her authority evaporated under the weight of indisputable truth. And I continued. Every act of humiliation, every interference, every dismissive comment has been noted and will be accounted for. Her lips parted slightly, but no words came. The first tears formed at the corners of her eyes, and I felt neither glee nor malice, only the quiet satisfaction of rightful vindication. The neighbors across the street nodded knowingly, the subtle filming on phones. Documenting every expression, I watched her realize that the tables had turned completely and that the power she had wielded for so long was gone, and in that moment I felt an incredible surge of empowerment, the quiet authority I had nurtured, the strategic patience, the meticulous documentation. All had converged to create this undeniable moment of triumph. I could see Diane whispering to Mrs. Henderson, "She's unstoppable." And I knew she was right. I calmly concluded the meeting, summarizing the legal protections, the documented efforts, and the moral authority I now held. She sat back, silent, fully comprehending for the first time the full scope of the mistake she had made. The confidence she once had was replaced by an awkward realization that everything she assumed was hers to control had slipped through her fingers. I felt the room shift, the air itself lighter and charged with a sense of justice finally served, and I realized in that moment that this was more than just reclaiming a house. It was reclaiming respect, dignity, and a life built on patience and perseverance. Every neighbor, every witness, every detail of the house now stood as a testament to the power of steadfast commitment and quiet strategy. And just wait until the next chapter, because the first consequences will unfold in real time, and you'll see exactly how the scales of justice tip completely and irrevocably in my favor. It was Wednesday, October 27th, 2021, at exactly 11:46 a.m. I had called a small neighborhood meeting in the Maplewood House living room, the sun pouring through the freshly painted lavender walls, highlighting the exact 47 rose bushes I had planted and the 12 jasmine bushes. Along the east side, the air smelled of cedar, roses, and jasmine, the perfect blend of victory and calm. I could hear the faint hum of traffic on 22nd Avenue and the soft buzzing of cicadas outside. I had invited Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Carlson, Diane, and even 2 other neighbors who had witnessed previous humiliations, and I could see the anticipation in her eyes. As I laid out the first concrete steps of justice, she entered cautiously, heels clicking softly against the polished floorboards of Tiffany lamp, $276.34, casting a warm glow that seemed to highlight her unease. I greeted her calmly, "Mom, please take a seat," and she hesitated. Finally lowering herself onto the sofa across from me, I began systematically addressing each act of interference, the first being the repeated public humiliation captured on phone and video, totaling exactly 6 separate incidents over the past 3 weeks with timestamps documented and witnesses confirmed. I outlined each expense: $1,872.50 for brushes, $2,137.89 for windows, $3,512.50 for paint, $38,472.89 in total renovations, $12,743.67 from side projects, all carefully accounted for and documented for potential legal review. Her face changed from disbelief to the faintest hint of worry as she realized that this was not simply a confrontation but methodical presentation of undeniable proof, I continued calmly explaining the legal ramifications of her interference, referencing estate and property laws with exact dates and clauses. Every act of interference, every humiliation, every attempt to undermine my claim has been documented and is supported by witnesses, I said clearly and directly. Mrs. Henderson nodded approvingly and whispered to Mr. Carlson, finally someone standing up with authority. Diane leaned forward and murmured, I never expected this level of preparation. The neighbors shifted slightly, some taking out phones to quietly record the discussion. The tension in the room was palpable, but in a different way than before. No longer humiliation, no longer fear, but respect and acknowledgement of the structured justice being presented. I noticed my mother-in-law fidgeting, her hands clutching her handbag, her eyes darting to the documents I had meticulously laid out. I see, she said quietly, her voice betraying surprise and perhaps a hint of regret. I paused, letting the weight of the documentation, witnesses, and financial transparency sink in. The room was silent, except for the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her shifting weight and the distant hum of traffic outside the window. I outlined the specific immediate consequences, given the documented evidence and witness testimony. The house rights and recognition of renovations and expenses are now legally binding in your favor. If continued interference occurs, it will result in formal legal action. And I watched as her expression shifted from disbelief to resignation. The air felt charged. Every detail, the polished oak table, the scent of jasmine, the Tiffany lamp, the sunlight through the shutters, seemed to emphasize the magnitude of the justice being delivered. And I felt a quiet satisfaction, not from vengeance, but from the realization that order, fairness, and acknowledgement were being restored. I continued outlining the exact timeline for compliance with house rules, restitution for disruptions totaling $1,250.47 for unauthorized alterations, and required acknowledgement of contributions to the house and garden. My mother-in-law nodded silently, finally absorbing the scope of her miscalculations. The witnesses whispered in approval, and I could see Diane recording discreetly for her own notes, and the neighbors exchanging subtle nods of admiration. The first tangible signs of justice were unfolding in real time, and the atmosphere shifted completely from tension and humiliation to respect and recognition. And I realized that this was only the beginning. The initial steps of restitution were being executed in full view of those who had witnessed injustice. And just wait until the next chapter, because the full impact will be felt by everyone involved, and you'll see how the culmination of years of patience, preparation, and quiet determination transforms the situation completely in my favor. It was Friday, October 29th, 2021 at exactly 4:12 p.m. The sun was low over the Maplewood neighborhood, casting long shadows over the freshly painted lavender walls of the house. The scent of jasmine, roses, and polished oak filled the air as if the house itself was acknowledging the shift of power. I had arranged a small gathering of witnesses, neighbors, and friends who had previously seen the humiliations unfold. Mrs. Henderson, Mr. Carlson, Diane, and 2 additional neighbors from 22nd Avenue were present, and I could feel the energy in the room charged with anticipation. My mother-in-law entered cautiously, her heels tapping softly against the polished floors, and the faint aroma of Chanel No. 5 lingering around her. She paused mid-step as she took in the gathering, and the documents neatly displayed on the polished oak table, every receipt, every note, every photo, $38,472.89 in renovations, and $12,743.67 from side projects, carefully organized in chronological order. The air was tense, but different from before. This was no longer humiliation. This was the full impact of justice being delivered. I calmly began outlining the final consequences. Given the documented evidence, witness testimony, and legal counsel, the house rights are now fully recognized in my favor. I said clearly and deliberately, and watched her eyes widen in realization. I continued detailing restitution for damages and interference, exactly $1,250.47 for unauthorized alterations, and the acknowledgement of contributions to renovations and garden totaling 59 documented instances over the past 3 months, each backed by photographic evidence, timestamps, and witness statements. I saw her shoulders slump and her confident smirk dissolve into an expression of disbelief and resignation. Diane whispered, "She's unstoppable," and Mrs. Henderson nodded in approval. I explained to neighbors and witnesses how any further attempts to undermine my rights would be met with immediate legal action, and the Atmosphere shifted to subtle whispers of admiration, and respect replaced the previous tension. My mother-in-law shifted in her seat, fidgeting nervously, and I could hear her mutter, I didn't realize. Every word weighed heavily as she finally comprehended the full scope of her miscalculations. I detailed how the community and neighbors had been observing and how the evidence of her previous humiliations had been documented and would be recognized formally in legal proceedings if necessary. The Tiffany lamp, $276.34, caught the sunlight and cast a subtle glow over the documents. In the room, I could feel the full impact of years of patience, effort, and strategic preparation coming to fruition. Every neighbor in attendance gave subtle nods, some quietly filming and recording for their own records, and the hum of quiet approval filled the room. I reminded everyone of the exact dates, hours, and documented act of interference, 6 recorded incidents, $1,872.50 in brushes, $2,137.89 on windows, $3,512.50 in paint, 47 rose bushes planted with care, every detail, now a testament to the justice being restored. My mother-in-law finally spoke, her voice small and faltering. I see now, and I nodded calmly, acknowledging her recognition without gloating. I then turned to witnesses and neighbors and said, let this be an example that patience, preparation, and dignity in the face of injustice can restore balance. And the room seemed to collectively exhale. The power dynamic had shifted completely. The humiliations she had previously inflicted were now publicly acknowledged as unjust, and her attempt to maintain control had been fully dismantled. I could feel the sense of validation, recognition, and triumph in the room. I glanced at the polished floors, the neatly spaced 47 rose bushes, the 12 jasmine bushes, the Tiffany lamp, and the meticulous documents, and realized that every act of preparation had paid off, not just in restitution, but in dignity and respect. And just wait until the next chapter, because the final transformation and reflection are about to unfold, and you'll see how this experience not only reclaimed my rights, but also reshaped my sense of empowerment and connection to the community and life itself. It was Sunday, November 7th, 2021 at exactly 5:18 p.m. The sun was beginning to set over the Maplewood neighborhood, casting golden light over the lavender walls of the house. I had fought so hard to protect the scent of jasmine, and roses mingled with the faint aroma of polished oak and freshly cleaned floors, creating a sense of calm triumph. I was sitting on the porch, the same spot where weeks ago I felt powerless, humiliated, and overlooked, yet now every detail. The 47 perfectly spaced rows, bushes, the 12 jasmine bushes on the east side, the Tiffany lamp, $276.34, softly glowing on the side table, and the neatly organized documents, $38,472.89 in renovations, plus $12,743.67 from side projects, stood as a testament to resilience, patience, and meticulous preparation. I reflected on everything that had happened, the humiliations, the sneers, the public interference, and the disbelief on my mother-in-law's face as she realized for the first time that her control had ended, and I understood that the real transformation had occurred within me, not in her. Her words and actions could no longer define my worth or diminish my efforts. I had learned that true empowerment comes not from reacting impulsively, but from preparation, strategy, and steadfast dignity. I thought about the neighbors who had witnessed the injustices, the friends who had quietly filmed the incidents, and Diane, who had watched the entire process unfold, and realized that the community had become an unintentional support network, validating the truth and reinforcing the change that had occurred. I closed my eyes and remembered the exact moments when humiliation had felt unbearable. The 6 recorded incidents, the spilled $34.76 of water on newly planted soil, the thrown silverware, and each time I felt small and powerless, and I realized that each of those moments had been an opportunity to build patience, resilience, and strategic awareness that ultimately led to this victory. I leaned back and allowed myself a quiet smile, feeling the warm Florida breeze brush against my face, the gentle rustling of leaves and distant traffic, creating a backdrop for reflection. I thought about the universal lesson here. Injustice and humiliation can happen to anyone at any stage of life, but with clarity, preparation, and calm determination, it is possible to reclaim dignity, power, and respect. No one should ever underestimate patience combined with strategy or the quiet strength of someone who refuses to be diminished. I looked at the garden, the exact placement of each of the 47 rose bushes, the 12 jasmine bushes, the polished railings, and thought about how every action I took, every dollar invested, every hour spent contributed to both the physical and moral foundation of my victory. And then I smiled, fully realizing that empowerment is not just about winning against someone else. It is about reclaiming yourself and your right to be recognized, respected, and heard. I felt the transformation complete not only in my life, but in the way my community saw me and the way my efforts and diligence have become undeniable evidence of capability, resilience, and strength. I turned slightly toward the camera, as if speaking directly to you, and said, if you've ever felt overlooked, humiliated, or powerless, remember this. Every act of preparation, every ounce of patience, every documented effort builds a foundation for your eventual victory. And I want you to take a moment to reflect on your own experiences, the injustices you faced, and the ways you can reclaim your dignity and power in your own life. Now imagine standing tall, your efforts recognized, your rights affirmed, your dignity intact. And I urge you to share this story with someone who needs to hear it, to comment below your thoughts, and to remember that empowerment and justice are possible at any stage of life. And finally, if this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell, leave your opinion in the comments, and join our growing community where we turn stories of injustice into lessons of resilience, strength, and empowerment. Never forget that your patience, preparation, and quiet dignity are more powerful than any humiliation or injustice, and this is the moment to reclaim them.